Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Language Justice and Equity for Home-Based Childcare Providers. Hola a todos, bienvenidos a Justicia de Lenguaje y Equidad para los proveedores de cuidado infantil basado en el hogar. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Next slide. So before we get into our discussion for today's session, I'd like to invite Elizabeth to come to the virtual stage and talk about language access.
Thank you, Jennifer. I will begin in Spanish and repeat in English. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Elizabeth y seré su intérprete de español e inglés con la Community Language Cooperative, la cooperativa de idiomas de la comunidad. Quiero agradecer su compromiso con la justicia del lenguaje, lo cual significa que todas las personas tienen derecho a hablar y ser escuchadas en el idioma de su corazón o en el idioma en el que se sientan más cómodas. Entonces, interpretaré esta reunión entre inglés y español simultáneamente. Una vez que termine de hablar, se activará la función de interpretación. En ese momento, elija su idioma preferido en la barra de herramientas en la parte inferior de su pantalla de Zoom, presionando el icono de interpretación. Si nos acompaña desde un dispositivo móvil, haga clic en los tres puntitos a la derecha de su pantalla que dice más o more y desde allí podrá elegir su idioma. Si usted es bilingüe en ambos idiomas, no es necesario elegir uno. Favor de hablar más despacio de lo habitual y hacer pausas a menudo para dar tiempo a la interpretación, especialmente si está leyendo una diapositiva. Por favor, haga una breve pausa antes de continuar. Gracias. Ahora voy a repetir esto en inglés y luego comenzamos. Hello, my name is Elizabeth, and I will be your Spanish-English interpreter with the Community Language Cooperative. I want to thank you for your commitment to language justice, which means that all people have the right to speak and be heard in the language of their heart or the language that they feel most comfortable in. Therefore, I will be interpreting this meeting simultaneously between English and Spanish. Once I finish speaking, we will turn on the interpretation function. At that time, please choose your preferred language on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen by pressing the interpretation icon. If you are joining us from a mobile device, click the three dots to the right of your screen that say More. If you are fully bilingual in both languages, you do not need to select one. Please speak slower than usual and pause often to allow time for the interpretation. Especially if you are reading a slide, please pause for a moment before continuing. Thank you. Can the host please turn on interpretation at this time?
All right, perfect. Do we have a hand raised? Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And for any folks that may be having difficulty, please select the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select the language that you would prefer. Perfect, thank you. And so briefly, we'd love to do a quick introduction. So hi, everybody. My name is Jen Newball. I'm the Community Outreach Manager here at Homegrown. And co-facilitating with me today will be Lynette Garcia, who is an interpreter and consultant with Community Language Cooperative, and Benu Chhabra, who is not only a home-based childcare provider, but also the president of the Bay Area Professional Family Childcare Network. And both will be sharing a little bit more about themselves a little bit further on in the session today. Next slide. Thank you. And let's just do a quick overview of the agenda for today's session. First, we're going to have a provider experience where Benu Chhabra is going to share with us her language justice journey. And then afterwards, Lynette will be discussing language power and oppression and the implications of language justice in home-based childcare. Afterwards, we'll get into a discussion around some tools that you can use, such as the language justice continuum. And then we'll hear from other providers of their experiences on inclusion and incorporating language justice best practices. Afterwards, we'll have a discussion around recommendations for folks that are in decision-making seats, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A after. Next slide. And before we get started, we'd love to also introduce you all to Homegrown, if any of you are new to us. Homegrown is a national collaborative of funders who are committed to improving the quality of and access to home-based childcare. We work in 4 pillars: policy, movement building, infrastructure and financing, and quality. Homegrown values providers as experts. Homegrown is committed to provider leadership as well as the inclusion of diverse voices, and we embrace the principles of language justice. Next slide. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce Benu Chhabra to share a little bit more about her language justice journey.
Hello, everyone from California, and welcome. And I just want to say thank you so much. I feel honored to be presenting this with Homegrown. I have done this at National Association in Atlanta, last time, and just an amazing journey. And I'm an early childhood educator for about 35 years and proud to be part of this team. I want to, like it says, I'm the president, and you see I'm the treasurer for that association, also the member at large for National Association. And I just want to begin by you all understanding that English is not my first language. So you will see on my slide, it says respect. I learned English at school in India a little bit. I came to the United States about 35 years ago. I speak 3 different languages: Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu. And I can understand 5 Indian languages. Respect. I believe language justice begins with basic respects of human being. We all don't speak the same language. In fact, according to my next point here, the slide, population. In fact, according to the US Census Bureau, nearly half of all Californians speak a language other than English at home. With being that said, we as family childcare educators, FFN providers, provide home from all those children who speak all those different languages. And all these languages, all the regulations when workshops, webinar, conferences are offered in English, we are leaving a large populations of our family childcare educators behind, right? So this is why, we need to include everyone. I would like to encourage, everyone to please be the change. Please join your local, state, and national association, which have many, many resources to support all of us early childhood educators. As you all know, that 95% of the brain development happens between the ages 0 to 5. And we're the one who's taking care of those children, right? So we need to have those resources in the languages that we can help and support our families, our children, and everyone around us. And I just wanted to say my journey started when I started becoming a part of my local association, my state, and we offer like different, our public policy calls, our webinars or our leadership cafes in different languages. So we can advocate by joining one another in a bigger number and make the difference that we need to make. So be the change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benu, for sharing your story with us. Next slide. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Lynette Garcia to talk about language justice and equity for home-based childcare providers.
Muchas gracias, Jen. Thank you, Benu, for that. My name is Lynette Garcia, and I'm here with the Community Language Cooperative, like Jen said, and it is a privilege to share a little bit more. Benu called us into action, right, to talk a little bit more, to get involved with our children locally, statewide. But how do we do that? How can we go into spaces with the language of our heart? I want to ask you all, if you can put in the chat, what is your language of your heart? In a minute, I'm going to switch over to Spanish because that's the language of my heart. I'm going to see if folks are sharing in the chat. Who's in the space? What is the language of your heart? The language of your heart. English, English. Beautiful, beautiful, right? Mine is not Spanish. Spanish, right, is a colonized language that was from the northern part of Mexico. Mine is Tarahumara, right? I wish I could speak Tarahumara, but we have disconnected. So I want to share a little bit more about what is language of the heart. And to our amazing interpreter, I'm about to switch over to Spanish. El idioma en el que tú puedes hablar, en el que tú te puedes conectar, que te sientas más cómodo, ese es el idioma de tu corazón. El idioma en el que puedes compartir, transmitir tus frustraciones, ¿verdad? Tus experiencias. En el que puedes pedir un tamalito, un taco. En el idioma que puedes compartir algo para comer. Eso es el idioma del corazón, ¿verdad? En el que puedes tú fluir naturalmente. En el idioma que tú escoges para hablar sobre las barreras que existen, sobre la falta de existencia para nuestros hijos, nuestras familias, ¿verdad? Tus frustraciones. En el idioma en el que tú debes ser considerado donde tú vayas. Tú tienes el derecho para poder pedir, ¿verdad? Esa ayuda que está hablando Benu, en el idioma de tu corazón. Próxima diapositiva. Hablamos un poquito sobre el idioma del corazón. Pasamos ahora a lo que es la opresión del lenguaje. Si podemos ir a la opresión del lenguaje, por favor, a diapositiva. La opresión del lenguaje es realmente entender, ¿verdad? El ver que hay faltas, que hay inequidades que existen en cualquier sistema, en el sistema educativo, en el sistema de cuidado infantil, existen esas inequidades donde hay el idioma predominante es el inglés, ¿verdad? Entonces, con esto, el impacto de la opresión del lenguaje tiene como objetivo, ¿verdad? Eliminar la barrera del idioma y proporcionar una aceptación, ¿verdad? Y ese reconocimiento pleno, completamente, del yo. Yo puedo entrar, o para que ustedes se puedan sentir plenos en cualquier espacio que puedan entrar, sentirse plenos y que pueden ser completamente ustedes, ¿verdad? Donde las personas pueden entrar en el color y el idioma y su cultura completamente y ser aceptados. Eso es lo que vemos, el impacto de la opresión del lenguaje en nuestras comunidades, ¿verdad? Cuando entramos a espacios donde no se nos reciben, ¿verdad? Tal vez con el mismo entendimiento, las mismas emociones, porque no podemos conectarnos de esa manera. Han habido tantas ocasiones, y puedo dar un ejemplo de la opresión del lenguaje. Si podemos ir a la próxima diapositiva, por favor. Una de las veces que yo recuerdo que tengo más en mi corazón es de esas veces donde yo veía a mi madre que batallaba el poder entrar a la escuela, ¿verdad? Con esas barreras que existen, esa opresión que ella podía entrar, no podía conectarse sobre mi educación porque tal vez la veían raro, porque tal vez no se podían conectar con ella para poder aprender sobre mis calificaciones, cómo iban mi educación, ¿verdad? Entonces vemos a menudo y no lo podemos descifrar, ¿verdad? Pero comienza con el racismo, comienza con la falta de inequidad y la opresión que existe con el lenguaje. Bueno, quiero definir primero que nada la justicia del lenguaje. Creo que leo un poquito más sobre la opresión, sobre el idioma y el corazón, pero ahora quiero entrar en lo que es realmente la justicia del lenguaje. Vamos a la próxima diapositiva. La justicia del lenguaje es esa práctica, ¿verdad? Aparte de lo que vimos ya, es la práctica que se hace con intención, ¿verdad? Con la que valoramos, con la que celebramos, las lenguas representadas. Ahorita nos acaba de decir, yo hablo tres, entiendo 5 lenguajes, pero también hablo otros 3, ¿verdad? Esa intención de valorar, ¿verdad? Las otras personas, ¿verdad? En un entorno, en cualquier espacio, la interpretación y la traducción, ¿verdad? Son herramientas fundamentales para abrir la comunicación. Sí, tal vez yo nomás sé español e inglés, pero cuando ponemos esa práctica de poder tener a un intérprete, tener a un traductor, eso es lo que hace la justicia del lenguaje. No tenemos que hablar todos los idiomas del mundo para poder tratar de practicar la justicia del lenguaje, pero realmente es formar, ¿verdad? Entender lo poderoso que es, ¿verdad? Y entender que podemos escuchar a otras voces en sus idiomas y tener la capacidad de conectarnos con ellos, ¿verdad? A pesar del idioma que sea, el tener las herramientas para poder entender y conectarnos en el idioma de nuestro corazón. Quiero hablar un poquito más sobre las implicaciones, pero las implicaciones que existen en el cuidado infantil, basado desde, como dicen, en homegrown, ¿verdad? Diría yo. Vamos a hablar sobre el rol que existe, ¿verdad? El lenguaje es más que un código, mediante el cual nos comunicamos. El lenguaje está relacionado con el conocimiento social, político, ¿verdad? Y el acceso a la estructura de poder. Hablamos ahorita más sobre las conexiones que existen, sobre cómo podemos nosotros involucrarnos, ¿verdad? Yo he visto a tantas personas y estoy segura que las personas que nos están viendo ahorita, que están aquí, que se nos unieron, están involucradas de una manera u otra en la política, abogando, apenas empezando a tener su liderazgo con el cuidado infantil, ¿verdad? Pero sabemos bien que esas son herramientas, la cuestión del lenguaje puede ser una herramienta para poder ayudarnos a empujar aún más en este país donde desafortunadamente, ¿verdad? El idioma predominante es el inglés, pero sabemos que esto es un poquito de lo que podemos empezar a practicar para empujar las estructuras de poder, que tal vez de una manera nos opresionan a nuestras familias y a los sistemas, ¿verdad? El idioma es esencial para acceder el empleo. Necesitamos, ¿verdad? Conectarnos para hablar sobre las oportunidades sociales que existen. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos incluir estas diferentes prácticas de justicia del lenguaje para poder tener acceso para nuestras comunidades, para nuestras familias, para nuestros hijos, para los niños que cuidamos en casa? Quiero pasárselo a Jen, que nos va a hablar un poquito más sobre las implicaciones que existen.
Thank you so much, Lynette. And can we go to the next slide? One more slide. There we go. Perfect. So yes, let's talk a little bit about language oppression and implications in home-based childcare. So one of the most clear implications in home-based childcare is forced assimilation. We're forcing people to live in the, what we view or what society views in this country as being the correct way, right? So we're forcing folks from out of their comfort zone to go into something that's completely different outside of their culture. But also it hinders child's learning. Something that I always think about is when you're older, when you're an adult, and being bilingual or multilingual is always encouraged and everyone's excited. They're like, oh, you could speak multiple languages. That's amazing. But really where the peak of the learning starts, is, as discussed earlier, is from 0 to 5. And by forcing, providers to not be able to speak in their heart languages or speak in the heart languages of the families, of the communities that they serve, you're hindering a child's learning by doing that. Also, communication and connection between provider and family. For a lot of folks, it's really culturally driven. A lot of families want their children to be with providers or be in the care of providers who speak the same language, who share the same culture. And by doing the forced assimilation and all of these other things, it really divides the connection between the provider as well as the family. And ultimately that affects the child. Also, providers may feel isolated from resources and other professionals. A lot of the resources that are out there today are not available in multiple languages. Some places are starting a little bit, but there's still a lack of access for so many providers, not only for Spanish-speaking providers, but also for so many other folks in different communities. So those are just some things to keep in mind, but of course, there are so many more examples here. Next slide. And so a couple of examples of language oppression in our field is, a really big one being licensing. In some states, there is licensing where they do have the resources available in different languages, like California. But for a large chunk of the country, majority of states do not have licensing materials available outside of English. So that automatically prohibits anybody who speaks another language to be able to access that and be licensed if that is their choice. So that is one clear example. Also, trainings. A lot of trainings are done only in English and are not open to doing it in multiple languages. We're gatekeeping information by doing that. If we're not here sharing the information for others, how do we expect other folks who want to get in the field to learn more, right? So we need to have more availability and more access to trainings in multiple languages. And also funding opportunities. Let's talk about like grants, or maybe it's for wanting to participate in an initiative, or any sort of thing that's a possible funding opportunity. A lot of those are only available in English. So that's already a huge barrier, and not allowing access or not having any accessibility for any folks from different communities who speak other languages. Next slide. But what are some ways that we can incorporate language justice in home-based childcare? So one of them being is we can incorporate more visuals, and we can also be more direct with our language. And also, being open and allowing parents and families to communicate in their heart languages, and being able to allow their child to also be in a space where they're able to openly do that. And also sharing resources with providers in their heart languages. Are we making things more accessible? How can we do that, right? Next slide. So what are some examples of language justice in home-based childcare? So as stated before, having resources and trainings available in multiple languages. And for any folks that are here that are in decision-making seats, are we working on like hiring providers that speak other languages, not just English or Spanish? And also, fostering the child's construction of a knowledgeable, confident self-concept and group identity. Next slide. I'd like to pass it over to Lynette.
Gracias, Jen. Elizabeth, I'm going to switch over to Spanish again, to our amazing interpreters. Bueno, tal vez ustedes nos pregunten, Lynette, Jen, Benu, ¿cómo llegamos desde la opresión del lenguaje, de exclusión, hasta la justicia del lenguaje? La cooperativa creó 6 indicadores que nos ayudan a entender un poquito cómo podemos llegar a la justicia del lenguaje, ¿verdad? No es fácil, es un proceso, toma tiempo, ¿verdad? Es un paso a paso. Primero es el entender, ¿verdad? Ustedes están todos aquí, aprendieron un poquito de qué es la justicia del lenguaje, ¿verdad? Aprendieron un poquito lo del idioma del corazón. Pero para poder llegar a la justicia del lenguaje tenemos que tener 6 cosas súper importantes. 1, a Elizabeth voy a cambiar a inglés. Allocation of resources, one of the indicators, right? We want to make sure that our organization, right, that our companies are allocating funds for translation, right, for interpretation, for capacity building, for our employees, for our colleagues, right? We want to make sure that we have that first indicator. And you can, like I said, you can go all the way from exclusion, oppression to language justice, right? And so in a minute, we'll share with you all the complete tool, but I kind of want to go through the 6 first. The second one is language needs assessment, right? Do we know what our organization needs, right? How many of our colleagues or employees heart languages do we need to identify, right? The language and level of interest of linguistically diverse community members, right? Who are we serving? Are we serving parents? Are we working with parents that it would be better for them to understand the work, the policy that we're working on, and our community, right? So really going out and serving, asking, taking that time, creating focus groups, right? right, to understanding the needs. Third, right, interpretation and translation. Meetings or public events are facilitated in the represented languages and interpretation is provided, right? Are we going to get together to advocate, right? And advocate and push for a policy around stipends, payments for better wages for our child care providers, right? How are we doing that? Are we getting together in these meetings with just one language? Are we just doing it in Spanish? And perhaps we're not thinking of our Arabic friends in our community, right? So I think that's a little bit of what we have to start doing, right? Kind of getting out of that comfort zone and being like, well, you know what? We don't have any funds. Well, then let's get some funds. Let's find an interpreter that understands our culture, that understands what our needs are, that understands what are we advocating for. There's a difference between having an interpreter and a community interpreter. Having a community interpreter is someone who understands what's happening, that's from the community, right? And we go back to the first one, the allocation of resources, making sure that we are finding resources. And I'm saying this because it sounds very hard, but you have a network here of friends that have the way of connecting you to different resources so that we can get funds to really push forward our work and really practicing language justice, right? And so it's not impossible, friends. And I think that we can definitely talk a little bit further, but knowing that we can definitely get those funds to pay back our community who have those skills to interpret. And I want to go to that next slide where the fourth one is literacy and translation, right? We want to make sure that all materials, like Jen shared, all materials are written and are accessible, right? Making sure that we are looking into using images, infographics, right? They're easier to read. It doesn't have to be text all the time. It can be images that perhaps if you have a smaller budget, you're like, you know what? I can't translate into 5 or 7 languages. How about if we create an image that really depicts and shares what is needed in our community, right? And that way we can perhaps share maybe save those funds for interpretation, because there's a difference between interpretation and translation, right? Interpretation is oral, is what Elizabeth is doing right now, interpreting simultaneously, right, into this space. And translation is written, right? So we don't have to spend money on translation, but perhaps we can spend our money on interpreting, having an interpreter from the community that can come and interpret for our training on advocacy, because we're going to go and push for higher wages for our childcare providers, right? So that's another thing that we can do. Now, I also want to talk about staff development. I shared with you all, right? Making sure that we are paying them right, equitably, right? If they speak more than one language, why not make sure that we pay them for the third language that they have so they can help us interpret for the focus groups that we're having, right? For a needs assessment focus group. Staff development really focuses on bilingual staff, trilingual staff, right? And offering them those leadership positions that they deserve so that they can really help push language justice forward. Culture and climate. It's a sixth one, right? Where our organization, our community, my business, right, encourages the community to speak in the language of their heart, right? People are proud to be bilingual and communicate openly. So why not foster that heart language so that folks can feel comfortable in whatever setting they are, and perhaps stepping back and being like, you know what, yes, my heart language is English, but why not like make sure that I have an interpreter for me, right? It doesn't always have to be the other way. I don't always have to get an interpreter for someone that speaks Hmong or someone that speaks any other language, but why not get an interpreter for me as an English speaking person? So that's a challenge that we can put forward when we talk about culture and climate. Changing those power dynamics, that can be hard. If you can share the full continuum, please. As shared, the continuum was created by the Community Language Co-op, and it's a tool that we use, that we share. You will all receive that as well, I think, right, Jen? It will be openly shared with everyone here in this space. You can use it with your company, with your organization, in the community that you are, and it really shares. of how to get from one end of language oppression, exclusion to language justice. And it's small steps like translating notes, right? Like translating your slide decks, making sure that you have that translation. And if sometimes I know that when I'm translating slide decks, we have them in 2 or 3 languages. It doesn't have to be like that, right? We can create them differently. We can create 3 slides. It takes time. And it can help us get there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lynette, for talking more about the language justice continuum. And yes, we will be sending it out via email, but we also put it in the chat. So you will also receive all this information via email along with the slide deck. Next slide. All right, so I love to transition over to Benu Chhabra, who's going to talk a little bit about the provider leader experiences on inclusion. And these next 3 providers are providers that we do work with, who we work with and also have seen their journey around language justice. And so let's go ahead and get into the next slide. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Jen. So here in this picture, you will see Oscar and his wife. Oscar and we are on the state association together, and he has done an amazing job. So he worked with family childcare communities throughout California, providing them with resources, opportunities, and support. And encountered a persistent language barrier that hindered access to information for non-English speakers, especially during the COVID-19 pandemics. So we got together, we brought in different webinars, and where he was able to help us also to translate in Cantonese, Mandarin, Chinese. So learn that language justice is the foundation of social justice, and that by bridging the language gap, we can foster a more inclusive, empathetic, and just society. Thank you. Here's Miss Deborah Young. She's from Colorado. And, recently I was in LA, and I have met her before in Phoenix as well through Homegrown. And in LA last week, she was there for Build California. So we were there. She's an FFN provider, parent educator, professor of early childhood education, founder of the Pomoza Early Childhood and Family Program that works with communities that are refugees and immigrants who are non-Spanish and English speakers. And recently when I was there, actually, I got to meet somebody with her who was also spoke different languages. So it was an honor. Language justice is important because it disrupts the dominant narrative and norms, addresses power dynamics that come with language access, and allows for co-create knowledge from different perspectives. With that being said, I would just like to say, how Lynette mentioned about the indicators, right, for language justice. She talked about allocation of resources. She talked about interpretations. So like from my personal experience and being part of the network, I highly encourage each one of you to go knock on the other provider's door, make that connection, be that change. I know you, like me, you speak many, many languages. Our group is diverse. So you know what? Go and help another provider and be the change. You can do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Benu. Thank you for sharing. And also just want to talk a little bit about Ruth Evangelista and share an experience that she shared with us. And so just to give you some background of Ruth, Ruth is an FFN home-based childcare provider based in Minnesota, but she's also a community advocate. She's a co-director of La Red Latina de Educación Temprana. And Ruth has been working on her language justice journey for many years. And over the past year, she's been sharing different tools, such as the language justice continuum, with the families and providers that are in her network. And she shared with us recently that, the providers have been able to use this tool in different settings. But one of the experiences that stuck out the most to her was actually with one of the FFM providers in her network who was unable to meet with her child's teacher because the school district could only provide interpretation for 15 minutes. So she wasn't able to actually have a full meeting with the teacher to really learn about, the status of her child's learning, where they're at in class, like what's going on. She wasn't able to get any of that information. And then she was given a progress report that was in English, so she couldn't even read and understand what was happening there because it was not translated into her heart language, into her spoken and written language. So what did she do? She realized that through language justice that she was able to say, no, I need an interpreter here, and I want an interpreter for the entire duration of this meeting with the teacher. And also she's getting not only the progress reports, status reports about her child's attendance and everything in Spanish, but other providers and other families that are within this community have also been actively doing this and asking for interpretation, saying that they need it when they're in these settings because it is their right to have that. And that's something that all of us on this call can do as well. It does not matter the language, we can ask for that and we can expect to receive it and we can advocate for that. And so a lot of families are now using this continuum and advocating for their right to have interpretation and to have, and not only in the school district setting, but also in many different settings. And, language justice is not only interpretation, but it's really a way to connect to the culture. Next slide. And so we'd love to talk a little bit about some of Homegrown's experiences as well as lessons learned. And over the past year, we have made it an organizational effort to be advocates for language justice. And, language justice allows so many providers to see that their perspectives matter and that their experiences matter. And most importantly, that their voices matter. And so for us as an organization, this really helps us because we're able to improve by learning from and amplifying the voices of all providers, regardless of the language of their hearts. Next slide. So what can we do? And here are a couple of recommendations for folks that are in decision-making seats. So, and by that, I mean anyone who's on this call that may be part of an organization, maybe a CCR&R, anyone who holds, who's in a decision-making seat. So what are some things that we can do? One of the ways that we can implement language justice is really by planning ahead. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to plan ahead with how we want to include language justice in our work. And, part of that is allocating resources. It's really time and money. There's a lot of time that needs to be spent on making sure that we're able to have everything translated into other languages. But also, and most importantly, is asking for feedback from your constituents. Are you meeting the providers and asking them, what are your needs? How can I better support you? Is there another language outside of English that maybe like they see is something that their community needs? Or maybe there are providers themselves who need this. Like, really, are we going out there into the field and asking folks, what is it that you need? But also we want to make sure that all information is available or can be translated in other languages. So this just goes back to the planning ahead piece. And another really important piece is really keeping the provider's needs at the forefront of the work. Going back to our why. Why are we in these positions? Why are we doing the work that we do, right? Because we want to be able to support the home-based childcare community, whether it be on the local, state, or national level. And by keeping the provider's needs at the forefront of the work, we're making sure that we're actually doing what we're supposed to be doing, right? Which is being that support system for them. Also, compensating providers for their expertise. And this piece I cannot emphasize enough. We have so many providers who are so talented and skilled and multilingual, who are able to do amazing, amazing things. But we also need to make sure that we're compensating providers for their time and the work that they're contributing to our organizations. And also it's 2023. We can no longer be benefiting from free labor. Also, this is continuous growth and improvement. Language justice is a journey, and there's always going to be some hiccups that come up, and we're going to need some feedback for things. But we're human. We're going to make some mistakes, but as long as we continue growing and learning from it, that's really what matters the most. And I'd like to also transition over to Lynette to talk a bit about this tool of CLC checklist.
Gracias, Jen. I want to share with you all this checklist that was created by the Community Language Co-op. And this is for providers. I wonder if we can share it, if we can see it for everyone. So this is a checklist that we created for meetings, for any space that you're attending, for any space that you're organizing. It could be used. It's very simple. It's a check. You can check that off. I urge providers, if you are going into and working with organizations, you could say, listen, here, do this. You want to invite our community to talk about certain policies. You want to invite our community to be engaged. Take this. And this checklist, it talks about the preparation of a meeting. It talks about first assessing the language needs, right? It's a checkbox, assessing the language needs. Okay, I know how many interpreters I need because our meeting is going to be 2 hours, 3 hours, right? For interpreters, our max that we can do because our brains work so miraculously, but also they need some space. 2 hours, right? 2 hours is a max. Be mindful, right? Be mindful of packed agendas, right? Plan to cover less material so that everyone can take in on the information, right? And we can have interpreters taking everything in. Request interpretation for the meeting with time, right? Request interpreters within 2 weeks. Do your research, right? How much we can't find an interpreter for perhaps month, right? In a day, right? We need to prepare ourselves so that it has a checkbox as well. Request translated material. So if you're a provider and you're like, hey, we're going to show up and we're going to advocate for this, let's go ahead and make sure that to whoever's organizing this meeting, that they know that we want translated materials, right? Check your technology, right? If you are facilitating, if you're organizing a meeting, make sure that you have time to look over what is needed. Are we doing it in person? Do we need equipment? Where do we look for equipment? Who needs to come with equipment? Set up a time to meet with the interpretation team so that they can share the flow of the meeting, so that they're aware, right? Even if they're part of the community, right? And they're interpreting, let them be a part of that meeting, that material to prep. Staff accordingly, right? Making sure that everyone has support in the space. Today, we have our amazing Karen kind of help us turning on interpretation, setting up the different things that have to go on into making sure the interpretation works, right? What to share with the interpretation team, the agendas, like I shared, the language needs, how many folks are going to be attending, the handouts, like I said, a glossary, right? There's different words that are being used in different communities, making sure that we have the right words that are being shared. The day of the meeting, setting up a space for equipment if you're doing it in person, for virtual meetings. Zoom is hard. It could be very confusing sometimes, right? So making sure that we have interpretation on and off, how to turn that on. Giving the interpreter space to talk about the language justice statement and to check the equipment, right? Today, our amazing Elizabeth came in and shared with you all, this is what we're doing. This is what interpretation, how it will look. I'm turning it on. I'm giving you all, give me a heads up, kind of let me know how that works. That's also very important at the beginning of the meeting, not just going off and interpreting, right? Making sure that everyone's aware of what's happening is very important. That's equitable, right? Including everyone in the conversation of what's about to happen. Working with interpreters, right? The best speakers are the ones who do not read from the slides, but the ones that can read the room, right? And adjust the material accordingly. Be aware of that, right? Yes, perhaps not all of us. I know for a fact that I'm not the best speaker, but I love to talk from my heart and I love to share everything and information from my heart. But I have to be aware constantly of my pace to make sure the interpreter is capturing everything. I want to go into the harmful practices. At the very bottom of the page, you all will be getting that document here in the chat. But knowing that if you rush through the tech presentation or the language justice statement, it could be harmful, right? It could be harmful for the folks that are in the space. Some folks, I know for a fact, when my mom used interpretation for the first time, she stayed quiet. Her equipment wasn't turned on. So making sure that everyone is on their heart language and interpretation mode so that they can capture everything from the beginning is very important, right? So allowing that space, because it could be harmful. They can miss out on a lot of stuff. Sitting non-English speakers all together, right? We're like, okay, well, let's make this easier so that we don't have to worry about 2 separate meetings or perhaps 2 separate groups. Let's just put all the English speakers and the non-English speakers on one side, so that way they can talk and we don't have to worry about interpretation. We don't have to worry about paying someone to come and interpret for us. That's also very harmful, right? Because we're excluding the connection, right? We're creating oppression within that. And then calling out people who receive interpretation, especially if there is only one non-English speaker, right? And being like, that person needs interpretation, or fulanita needs interpretation. Be very harmful, because at that time you're already creating a space of where, well, there's only one person. One thing that I like to do when we have a space with more than 2 languages is being very open and instead being like, okay, everyone that is only an English speaker gets a headset, right? Kind of changing the dynamics, and also asking, right? Being open into the space of like, hey, who needs interpretation, right? And opening and having a conversation one-on-one, having enough time to talk to the folks that are going to be a part of the meeting is very important as well, so that they know how interpretation works from the beginning. And I think that is it. I hope, please use this checklist. Like I said, if you're a provider, if you're a stakeholder, if you're advocating, if you're a community leader, expert, I urge you to share this with you and request it, and be like, this is, you're holding a meeting. Make sure that you look through this checklist before you invite me into the space. Or if you are even a policymaker, I urge you as well. Be prepared, because there's community members that really know that their right in the every space is to be connected and connect in the language of their heart.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lynette. I really appreciate you sharing that great resource. And just to everybody in the chat, we will be sending out all this information via email, so you still will receive it in an email along with the link in the chat. We'll go ahead and transition into the next slide. All right, and so now we'd like to open up the door and hear your thoughts and your questions. And please feel free to, write your question in the chat if you wish, or you can raise your hand. That way Karen can unmute you so you can say your question verbally. Yidelkis? Oh, you are muted, my dear. All right.
¿Me escucha ahora?
Sí, ahora sí. Podemos escucharte, Yidelkis.
¿Me escucha?
Sí. Podemos escucharte.
¿Me escucha?
Sí, podemos escucharte.
No te escucho a ti.
Yidelkis, la escuchamos.
Ay, ¿qué pasa? Bueno, de todos modos, si usted me está escuchando, para decirle buenas tardes a todas. De verdad que estoy muy contenta, muy feliz. Me emocioné mucho de saber que están hablando en inglés y yo estoy escuchando en el español. De verdad que muy agradecida, de verdad, lo voy a compartir. Thank you, gracias.
Oh, muchísimas gracias, Yidelkis. Gracias por compartir. All right, and I see we have a question here in the Q&A. How do you share with your organization that sometimes the language is not interpreted to the intent, and Google Translate does not always support our communities? Absolutely, and I feel like that's a very that's a fabulous question, and I think that's also a conversation to have with the organization, saying that Google Translate really does not do an adequate translation. It's a great resource and it's great to use, but it's not going to be the same as getting someone to translate it, because it is missing a lot of important pieces. So it is encouraged, like I definitely would encourage you to have that conversation with the organization, and even share maybe some of the tools from today's session, but also sharing that, Google Translate cannot translate everything. And a lot of things, especially like say in the example of Spanish, A lot of things that are discussed in English, whether it be like in the field, are a lot of, you know, ideas or concepts that do not have a direct translation. And so even sharing that piece where, like, you know, if we have an idea or a concept that we want to share, this is not going to do an adequate translation, right? So even just bringing up that example and sharing it with your organization, that may do the trick. But I'd love to open it up to the other panelists as well and hear their thoughts on that.
I could add, Jen, if you would like. Like, for example, for our California Family Childcare Network, what we do is we bring in the interpretation people who can come and translate. So we have like our public policy call. I mentioned earlier, Leadership Cafe, or our forum also. You know, we did in like Cantonese, Mandarin, and Spanish languages, but I remember you talked about the resources, right? So we as an early childhood educators don't have resources that much because everything needs funding, right? So we got this PVCA grant, and that's why we are able to use some of those funds to translate. So that helps a lot. And like you mentioned, Google doesn't translate everything, but when we bring in the person, and I remember when Lynette was there at the NAFCC conference, you know, she was doing it in person translation, and it's amazing. So I think these are the resources that's much needed in our field. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Sure.
Benu.
I just want to say that, yes, even if we are providers, if we are leaders in organizations, every community is different. Perhaps the lingo that happens in my community in California might not be the same as the lingo that's happening in the community in Texas, right? And so if we want to put intention behind language justice, the intention is in making sure that we understand the communities when we're interpreting and translating, and not just using Google, because Google could be from Spain, where it can use different Spanish. And so really setting that intention of how we want to connect with the community, because it's not just the checkbox of like, yes, we translate it, it's done, it's Google. No, right? So letting your organization know that there's intention behind how we connect. If we want to engage, we have to do it the right way and the transparent way of how we would like for us as perhaps English speakers would like to be connected if it was the other way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynette. And we do have another question in the chat. Are there AI devices available to help providers in small meetings with parents? You know, there are devices that are available out there, but there's also a lot of issues that come with these devices, right? There's also a lot of tech support needed. So I don't feel comfortable endorsing any device at this moment, since there are a lot of issues that come with these devices. I do think that they can help if you're in a pinch and you need something very last minute, but it's not the same as being able to have that direct conversation. But I'd also love to hear what, if the other panelists have anything that they'd like to add to that question.
I will always resort to the human connection and the experience, right? My experience, I have seen providers in other organizations become interpreters and be able to, I know that there's a difference, and this might be different, but there's a difference in how we share and how we interpret. We interpret from the heart, being able to share when someone is speaking and share that passion and not having that monotone of like, this is what they're saying kind of thing is hard, right? But making sure that you are respecting whoever is speaking the language of their heart, that you're respecting their passion, their anger. Interpreters have to share the same emotion. If someone is mad at a policymaker, they have to transmit that through their passion and through the way that they're interpreting, right? And we don't get that with AI, right? And it goes back to also technology.
And you said it right, Lynette. Thank you. I just wanted to say, you know, we are the one who are like, you know, it's all about building relationships and connections. And when we are in person, like talking our home language, speaking the language of our heart, that's very important. And that's why, you know, we need to build those connections, stay connected with one another, and be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Benu and Lynette. And also just want to add something that Karen also shared in the chat is that Homegrown, we sometimes use Google Translate as a first step, but then we have an experienced translator review the translation and also make the connections. And like Lynette said, having a little human touch on there as well. I think we have time for one more question if anybody would like to share. All right. Oh, and we have a comment here from Yudelkis. She says, me ha perdido tantos clases por no hablar inglés. She said that here that she's missed so many trainings and classes because of that she can't speak English. But now that she's able to now. Thank you for sharing, Yudelkis. Muchísimas gracias por compartir con nosotros.
Yudelki siga abogando para que estos entrenamientos se le den en el idioma de su corazón. Sí se puede.
Exactly. And Rosa shared that thank you. That she appreciate the class. Thank you. And thank you, Mary. And with that being said, let's go ahead to the next slide. We thank you all for joining us here today. And we also wanted to share our contact information. And of course, you're going to receive all this via email from all of us. But if you are interested in exploring your own language justice journey or may not be sure where to start, highly encourage you to please check out with Lynette. She can definitely share some steps and how really to get started with that. And of course, if you have any questions from the provider aspect and perspective, definitely encourage you to check in with Benu so that way she can share a little bit more as well. But thank you so much. We will send everything via email. If you have any questions or comments, please share with us in response. But thank you all for joining us here today. Take care and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.